and you're listening to the University of Chicago's Public Policy Podcast.
Welcome to Latin America Matters, a podcast about the innovative policies and political debates Latin America has to offer to the rest of the world. Stay tuned to hear from policymakers and experts talk about the research and practice all over the continent, from the Antarctic to the Chihuahuan Desert.
Hi everybody, welcome to this episode. This is Giuliana Huarcaja, a second-year MPP student at Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Today we are talking about growth diagnosis as a methodology to determine obstacles to a country's capacity to grow. The Growth Lab at Harvard Center for International Development works to understand the dynamics of growth and to translate those insights into more effective policymaking in developing countries. In this episode, we will explore more about this tool with our guest, Miguel Santos.
Miguel is an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also director of applied research at the Growth Lab in the Center of International Development of the same university. He works in research projects all around the world, helping governments to rethink their development strategies, both at the national and subnational level.
Hello, Miguel. Hello, Giuliana. Thank you so much for joining us today in our LAM series. We would like to start a conversation, Miguel, asking you what would you tell us about the growth diagnostics methodology you've been working on in the Harvard Growth Lab and its relevance in today's context?
Yes, thank you for the invite to the podcast. The growth diagnostic methodology came now 15 years ago at first in a paper by Danny Roderick, Wong, and Ricardo Hausman. And it was a response to the approach that had failed in Latin America and lead to a lot of disappointment on the laundry list reform. It's like reforming everything that you can reform as if everything had the same importance or priority. So that experiment was embodied in what it's called the Washington Consensus of we're going to give you these 10, 12 reforms. You have to do them all at the same time to the best of your ability. Failed in the 2000s. So the growth methodology, the growth diagnostic, came as a response to that and is a methodology based on, first, on the assumption that inputs to development are more complement than substitutes. If you buy that inputs are more complement than substitutes, therefore the factor that it's in the lowest relative supply at a specific moment in time, it's what it's binding your growth and development process the most. So the methodology initially proposed a set of tests organized along 4 principles of differential diagnosis that will help you in identifying a sort of a ranking of priority for reform on the principle that if you pick the reform that you had measured or estimated to have the higher impact, by changing that, you will release the most binding constraint, and at the same time, you minimize what is called the second best problem, which is you might have negative second round impacts on other variables, but by picking the one with the highest direct impact, you minimize the possibility that second best would lead to overall negative outcomes. So now, like international financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, regularly use it in the process of diagnosing countries, and also think tanks like Millennium Challenge Corporation and so on. So it has become widespread. There has been a lot of learnings, but those are the basics of the methodology. Can we prioritize reforms if we have limited resources, limited capacities in the state, and limited span attention for policy? If I can change worth 1 or 2 things, what would those 1 or 2 things be? That's the answer that growth diagnostics sort of responds.
And I imagine that in such a dynamic context as the ones you and the Growth Lab have been working on, sometimes the conclusion of the research doesn't align with the political interests of the government or the actors you are advising. So I wanted to ask you if there are any cases you worked in the past where the reaction was positive, even when it doesn't align with the political interests. I will start with the politicians, but then also other actors like in the private sector.
The problem when you do this work from the outside, like we do, I work in the Growth Lab at Harvard University. We are a think tank. We do research and then we communicate the results of research. The problem when you come up with something that the place has not conceived or does not agree is the most binding constraint is that you will likely not find enough political capital to implement it. So you need to have a partner and the government that believes in your work and it's willing to undertake the reform associated to those results. Some issues are tough for political economy issues. For instance, infrastructure, it's a classic. If you give me money to build a piece of infrastructure and I am not corrupt and I have the right engineering team, that's something I can do. So I can get the money invested and get the piece, and that doesn't really force me to coordinate among different parties or develop some sort of state capacity. Usually there's a lot of money around infrastructure. We rarely have detected infrastructure to be the constraint. So in places where we work, like Chiapas, for instance, in Mexico, and tell the governor, listen, infrastructure is not the main constraint. You are a 5 million people small state. You have 3 airports. You have 1 port. You have a great network of roads. Don't continue investing on this because it's not going to make a difference. That was met with a lot of resistance. In other cases, you bump into constraints that are related to how people perceive themselves or the history of places. For instance, Panama. Panama is a place that it's among the 5 fastest growing economies over the previous 15 years. It grew thanks to a very sophisticated service export sector that requires a lot of skills that the Panamanian education system does not generate. So how come they grew so much in sectors that require human capital and skills the Panamanian education system doesn't generate? It's because they got a huge foreigners inflow. And that is something that a place like Panama, with all its past and the relationship of occupation of the canal by the United States, etc., doesn't deal well with. You telling them, if you want to keep on growing fast in these sophisticated sectors, you need right now more foreigners. Yes, invest in improving your education, but it will kick in 10, 15 years down the road. So you're rising a constraint that might come in the future. But if you want to keep on growing now, you need foreigners. That bounces into the image the country has of itself, the country they have of them, the concept they have of themselves. And clearly, it's more like an adaptive challenge. How do you get to sell that idea? Good surprises came in Buenos Aires, for instance. The chief of the Buenos Aires city, which is the actual name, requested the team to help him think in a productive development strategy with the aim of trying to isolate Buenos Aires from the shocks of Argentina at large. And I'm sure people listening to this and you, Andrés, as an Argentinian, might be like smiling at this. It's really hard, but we did some background research before accepting the project. And we found there are many, many capital cities in the world that have managed to have a growth trajectory that departs from that of the countries. Of course, this process has its limits, but there are cities that have decoupled the growth trajectory to what happened to the country at large. And you, of course, get to that by increasing the exports of the city to the world, because then you become more dependent on the world demand and not on the internal dynamics of the macroeconomics of the country that determine domestic demand. So by focusing on a number of export sectors that were already present or had a lot of potential in the city, we do believe that the city has a chance to increase its exports outside Buenos Aires, outside Argentina, and in that way become more resilient to, the macroeconomic instability that has become now common to the country.
Miguel, from your years of work in Latin America, like doing this growth diagnosis, can you tell us of a case or cases of constraints you found most impressive?
Definitely Chiapas, it's a place that had ticked all the boxes you would tick if you were a policymaker trying to spark development. They had invested in infrastructure, they had invested in education, they have invested in health, they had conditional cash transfers to reach out the population. They had put every single piece you will tick. And 20 years after the Zapatista revolution, which is the reason that sparked all this policy attention, they were still lagging behind. And there we came to the importance of the ecosystem. It's a massive coordination issue because you want to bring modern business to Chiapas, but they depend on other business and on other skills that are not there. Therefore, they will not come until the others are there. So it becomes like a party where there's no one in the party, and as long as there's no one has any incentive to arrive. But once you know everybody's in there, then you have enough incentives to go there, like the network, the ecosystem, it's already present. Governments have a role to play in generating this ecosystem by solving these coordination failures that prevent business from coming together to a place. But that's a message that it's really hard to swallow. That's something that it's hard to understand. I'm not talking to you about education and improving schools. I'm not talking to you about infrastructure. I'm talking to you about state capacity and about the need to reach out to the national government and to the private sector in Mexico and to the private sector in Latam and try to coordinate a number of business to come together in your state. And that's something that it's hard to learn. Now, one of the more daunting constraints we have found in Loreto, capital Iquitos, which is a place where we have recently finished work trying to develop a growth strategy for the region, which, as you know, is one of the poorest regions in Peru, and it has a lot of social deficits, like malnutrition, and now, ironically, it's been one of the places that got the hardest hit from COVID, so the situation that it's really sad. And we were trying to come up with a development strategy for the place that is consistent with the environmental equilibrium, because this place yields a lot of services to the world in the form of ecosystems. And of course, there the massive constraint, it's connectivity of transportation. When we arrive in there, we realized when we started calculating economic complexity, which is a sort of a measure that expresses how much knowledge is agglomerated in a place, we discovered that in Iquitos, there's a lot of know-how, a lot of industries we didn't think we will find there, but these industries didn't have the capacity to sell abroad Iquitos to the rest of Peru or to the rest of the world. And one of the reasons we found is that the daunting transportation costs have operated like a commercial barrier. Imagine a place where you impose a huge tariff on imports, therefore no imports come, or they are very expensive, and domestic businessmen have incentives to put up those goods and services in the place. But because they are protected, they don't do it with the efficiency required to sell them abroad. So, ironically, we told them, you do have know-how, you do have an ecosystem, it's inefficient because there's a huge barrier, and you need to bring down this barrier. And then we moved on to analyze, how can you do that? And you can do it by air. Iquitos is extremely well connected by air, but the number of products that you can export by air, it's extremely limited to a range of high value added products that can bear the cost of air transportation. A road will cause environmental damage in a way that it's hard to recoup only by economic benefits. So we ended up looking at ways of making more efficient transportation by river, which is, I don't know if you guys know, Iquitos is the largest city in the world that you cannot reach by road. You can get only by plane or by river. So there's a system of boats that do transportation by river, very informal, very irregular, very different levels of capacity. When you ask how long is this going to take, they tell you between 4 and 8 days. You're like, okay. So a small business cannot bear the cost of uncertainty.